Hi, this is Zach Baker, Director of Critical Debate for Candor Briefs, and today we'll be talking about the Biopower Kritik for the September-October LD topic on college admissions. Now, biopower is a term you may have heard before, but it's drawn from the work of a philosopher named Michel Foucault, a French author and theorist who wrote most of his key texts in the 1970s and 80s. Biopower, incidentally, is not one of the major focuses of his work. It's actually drawn from a series of lectures he gave while teaching in the mid 1970s, and a concept from which he kind of moved on in his later work. And so it's a little bit of a niche group of writings and texts, mostly picked up by secondary authors interested in the concept. Biopower, briefly defined, is the idea of power over the bios, or life, of human populations. And what Michel Foucault was referring to was the idea that over time, governments begin to shift their power and focus of control away from what he calls the ancient regime, or sovereignty, the idea that a government can put someone to death for violating the rules, to an active control over life and the way that people live. So Foucault constantly drew upon history and historical examples to try and prove his arguments, and he referred to feudal societies, or societies where serfdom was a very common employment opportunity for peasants, essentially. And in those societies, the only relationship between the peasant and the government was if they met minimum standards of providing enough taxes to the king, and beyond that, they were functionally left alone, unless they were observed to be a criminal in some way. And in the 1800s, Foucault argues that this shifts in a very noticeable way with the invention of fields like public health, or Michel Foucault wrote some books about the development of sexuality, or prisons. You may come across references to those in this literature base, describing how institutions changed their function in a specific historical period of time. Hospitals being one of them, also. And all of these things taken together, these institutions that shift from being focused on penalizing people for breaking rules to trying to induce people to live in specific ways, are what Foucault refers to as disciplinary institutions, ones that provide discipline and correction. That's a key word, because instead of simply just saying pay the penalty for breaking the rules, they attempt to teach you or educate you. There's a bunch of vocabulary words, verbs for what they're doing, to live in the way they want you to, or a way that is desirable for society. And these set of disciplinary institutions are historically contingent. That's an important theme in Foucault's work. These things are not inevitable, but came about because of a specific process, and their functions are discernible to a sufficiently attentive analyst. Now, some background on the concept of biopower. It draws on the work of a number of them, but the two most important German philosophers prior to this point, Nietzsche and Heidegger. Now, Foucault, and some authors argue this, kind of saw himself as the next Nietzsche, and he referred to his practice of writing about historically contingent institutions as genealogy, which is another term that pops up in the literature very frequently. And the idea is that he's writing the history of the present by describing all of the twists and turns it took to get us to where we are. And the use of the term genealogy is a direct reference to Nietzsche, who wrote a book called On the Genealogy of Morals, arguing that morals were a type of historically contingent institution that was not inevitable. And then the reference to Heidegger is this question of subjectivity, which I'll be talking a lot about in this video. Heidegger wrote a book called Being in Time. That's a very important philosophical text which attempted to establish questions of philosophy from the perspective of the subject who exists in time. And a lot of Foucault's work is dedicated to, the word he uses is excavating, because he sees his work as archaeological. Again, these references to history are a huge part of Foucault's method of excavating the modern subject out of its context, out of the things that shape it into what it is that we don't have control over, to kind of see what the essence of the subject is. And if you are unfamiliar with philosophical literature, the use of the term subject simply means what you think of yourself. The subject is your relation to yourself. So subjectivity is the noun form of being a subject to yourself. It's your self-conception. And it's very important to philosophers to think about this question, because what we think of ourselves shapes what we think of the world and how we act in it. So different types of just subjectivities that arise in different places often have a very important impact on the way that events unfold. Now, this broad idea connects to the topic in three kind of specific areas that I'll briefly outline here for you now. The first is that schools are disciplinary institutions. Now, I mentioned those a minute ago. Disciplinary institutions are these organizations, with physical buildings as well as with, non-physical ideologies driving them, that are dedicated to getting people to live in certain ways. So obviously the school is one of them, because it teaches students not only content, but a bunch of unwritten rules as well. Think about your time in school. You didn't just read books, you read books in a classroom with a teacher who had a series of rules that you had to follow. There was a grade system that you had to get certain points by doing certain things, right? There are certain authority figures that you had to listen to and appease in order to have a better time. You had to walk in lines in hallways. In general, like, the types of buildings that schools are look very different than most other buildings do. And these are all clues to a Foucauldian, that's the term for one who is a Foucault scholar, that some form of disciplinary institution exists. And some of the evidence in the file describes this process, how the gamut or the constellation of disciplinary institutions, the school is one of the most paradigmatic ones, or obvious examples of it, because the school doesn't try to hide its disciplinary function like some other institutions might, but is openly explicit about teaching you how to live the way that the people who control the school want you to. And that makes it a disciplinary institution. And this applies to not just like K through 12, but also universities, which would have been a very important issue in Foucault's day. A brief historical note. In 1968, there was a very large and important protest in France over conditions in universities called May of 68. It eventually grew to encompass many other issues, but the question of how universities would function in France was at the foremost of their cultural debate at that time. The second place that Foucault's literature intersects the topic is that admissions specifically are a function of what Foucault called governmentality. So we've talked about disciplinary institutions. Governmentality is kind of the abstract term he gives for the way and the technologies. Again, technology in the way that Foucault uses it doesn't literally mean circuitry and computers, but a tool. So a hammer is a technology the same way your computer mouse is a technology. And so governments have technologies the same way anything else does. And one of the primary technologies that Foucault said the government used to exert its power was surveillance. So previous topics which have dealt explicitly with surveillance have generated a lot of discussions about Foucault's work for this reason. Foucault wrote about a concept called the Panopticon. So pan means all, and then opt, see, econ, which was the idea that the best and most efficient way to organize a prison was to have it so that any inmate could be being watched at any moment, but didn't know if they were or weren't. The idea that the threat of being watched was sufficient to prevent people from acting out, even if they weren't. So the idea is that technology of governance is to threaten people with being watched so that they always wonder, and police themselves. Right, this move to self-policing is a big part of what biopower means, because when you are being coerced to live in a certain way, as opposed to constantly threatened with penalties, you adopt those practices yourself willingly. And then, even more interestingly, Foucault said that if surveillance is the primary technology of governmentality, the primary example of surveillance is what he calls the exam. Now, he doesn't literally mean a test that is given, but he means if the question of surveillance is, am I being watched? The exam is the instantiation of being watched, so that at any moment you can be tested to ensure that you're in compliance with the norm of governmentality. And so admissions would be a function of that. Having seen that schools are disciplinary institutions, admissions is simply a gateway check to make sure that you are on track. And if you're not sufficiently on track, you don't get admitted into the next level of education. So the weed out process is a form of exam. Like, do you have the right credentials based on our academic system? Do you have the right personality traits based on our academic system? Do you have the right scores? These are all questions that admissions officers are asking of any potential applicant, and if the answer is no, then you get rejected. And then the third intersection between Foucault's work and the topic is this concept of power knowledge, and it's a hyphenated word, so it's power hyphen knowledge, but as one word. And the idea here is that in Foucault's work, necessarily any claim to know what the world is like is connected to a power apparatus. Now, this is the aspect of Foucault's work that makes him what we would now call a postmodernist thinker. The idea being that objective truths don't exist, but that any truth only exists in reference to some scheme of society that predates it. This is like a fundamental thesis that you can go af or neg on, but it's something that Foucault believed. And he believed that education was an instance of this function of power knowledge. In particular, what that means is that anytime you're told something is true in a school or pedagogical environment, you can't separate the truth of the thing you're learning from the people who are teaching it to you. So a good example of this would be how, in the 1800s or early 1900s, debates over evolution being taught in schools were very controversial, because the knowledge of the origin of species was always connected to one cultural power versus the other cultural power, and so the debate over what is taught is necessarily a debate between worldviews or ideologies. Examples in Foucault's work he gives are he references literature from even as late as 1750 describing dragons. So biological researchers who look at fossil records and oh, these things are dragons. And that was the best science at the time. Everyone thought it was rock solid, but then later rejected it. There's a lot of examples of these sort of moments in scientific history where things that were thought to be uncontrovertibly true end up getting overturned by later experimentation. And Foucault thought that was an example of how when power changes, so does knowledge. So I think that's enough background, and I'm going to go ahead and read the shelf for you. It's not very long, so this shouldn't take too long, I don't think. 1NC begins, alternatives to standardized test scores are non-cognitive tests which purport to measure creativity and explicitly make use of biodata. Pretz and Kaufman 15. The most vocal critic of the traditional admissions process has been Sternberg, who used his WICS model as a source of essential yet unmeasured constructs such as creativity, practical intelligence, and wisdom. Another approach to alternative admissions strategies has been introduced by Schmidt. Schmidt has used biodata and situational judgment measures that focus on 12 non-cognitive dimensions, for example, multicultural appreciation and tolerance. The affirmative shifts from a standard evaluation of aptitude towards an embodied calculation of human capital as exemplified in soft variables like creativity or leadership. This is the ontological process of late neoliberalism, which positions subjects as willing and complicit with their own degradation into servility. Every shift in college admissions policies is accompanied by a corresponding shift in the conscientious self-discovery and applicants who chase certain extracurriculars or experiences to satisfy the desires of the admissions board, entrepreneurs of the types of selves which will succeed in maximizing their value. Jeronin 13. Human existence is inframed into usable reserve. Homo economicus, the worker of liberalism, turns into a human capital of neoliberalism. The usable reserve of the individual's acquired skills and genetic qualities. Such a change signifies an ontological process. Human beings are constantly optimized in order to flexibly serve the instrumental interests of profit making. Human beings eventually turn into the entrepreneur of the self. Ontological monopolization creates ontological violence that destroys the conditions for possibility in being. In short, the impact is nihilism. Jeronin 13. Ontological monopolizations constitute violence through two reciprocally conditioning mechanisms. First, through appropriation, which works by intrinsically concealing the openness of being and its possibilities, and second, through the violence intrinsic in particular historical modes of revealing, the ontological ordering of entities in neoliberal enframing. Refers to the fundamental impossibility for the different forms of life to emerge. Designated positions violently enframe human existence. While the institution attempts to create identities in line with their disciplinary mission, resistance is imminent in the fabric of the social. Actively subjectivizing to produce meaning outside the scope of productivity is an ontologically prior method of resistance. The key is not to discover your identity where you are told it is, but to create one yourself in the iterative journey of critique and questioning. Leask 12. Changes brought about in the name of a greater and increased vertical power are necessarily counterproductive. What was demanded was life understood as realization of potential, the right to discover what one is. Because power has become multiple, so too has the nature of resistance. Resistance is as widespread as power itself. There is no pure law of the revolutionary. There is a plurality of resistances. It is for all, by all, and everywhere. The capacity for transformation, for the ongoing construction and reconstruction of strategic relations, has a kind of ontological priority. Active subjectivization, emerging as a counter to passive subjection, subjects' ongoing creation by a strategic localized opposition of new practices of self-production, not self-discovery. We fabricate ourselves, constitute ourselves via critical resistance. So there's a lot of vocabulary in this 1NC, and I'll go through a couple of the more difficult pieces of terminology. So the first is this question of ontology. What the word ontology means is the philosophical study of things that exist, categories of existence, and so forth. And in the context of this discussion, we're again referring to power knowledge, right? Because every claim to knowledge is conditioned in relation to a set of power that includes knowing what the world is. So ontological categories, i.e. this thing is that type of object, or is an object versus a subject, those claims are all power claims. So talking about the affirmative in relation to ontology simply means that the power dynamics behind the affirmative have a series of ontological commitments, or a series of beliefs about the way the world is structured, and that those beliefs about the way the world is structured aren't necessarily true. They may be true, they may be false, but our belief in whether or not they're true or false is a function of power. And it's not necessary to believe this way. There's always another way to believe. So we can talk about the effects of believing one way versus the other way. So the first Geronin piece of evidence says that the calculation of human capital, a term from economics, which means that the sorts of things that people get that make them more valuable economically, so having skills is an example of human capital because it's not money, but you can use it to get money. To soft variables, so as opposed to a clearly demonstrable skill, a question of your personality. The evidence refers to creativity or leadership. That was the first piece of evidence. This is an ontological process because the frame for what humans are and are not has changed. And the term Homo economicus in this piece of evidence is a reference to the scientific name for human beings. Right? You've heard that we're Homo sapiens. A term in Foucault's literature, he says that we become Homo economicus, or economical human, as opposed to sapien or wise human. Because capitalism, something that Foucault was against, turns us into people primarily focused with our economic situation. And so the Geronin evidence makes reference to this idea of the Homo economicus. The idea is that instead of simply being workers, you go to the factory and work for the designated period of time and then go home, we turn into human capital because we're always developing skills that we think increase our valuableness as people instead of simply as workers. And that's the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism. Neo meaning new, so the idea is there's two different systems. We were in an old one, but we're in a new one. This echoes Foucault's point about the shift from sovereignty to biopower. But that's what the ontological process is referring to, this idea that we change from being one type of people to another type of people because of the social systems that we live inside of. And then the second Geronin piece of evidence is talking about this idea of nihilism and enframing. What this simply means is that the world created by this ontology, so if all human beings are workers trying to increase their productivity, the world we get is not one you would want to live in because work, and this is a point that he makes, work is something that degrades the humans who are doing them. This is not always true, but keep in mind that Foucault's context is 1970s France. France had gone through the Industrial Revolution not too long ago. They did it. And there were still very large portions of the country that were experiencing the wealth inequalities generated by the shift from agrarian farm society to an industrialized one. So what he's talking about with this idea is that when you can only be one way because of the ontology you're in, that is a form of violence because it has removed from you the freedom to choose for yourself who you are and what you will be. And that's the ontological ordering that the Geronin evidence is referring to, this idea that one particular ontological frame for who you can be and what you can be has been placed above all others, such that there's no longer an ability to move between them. And finally, this Leask evidence, it uses the word immanent in the first sentence of the tagline. Immanence is another concept that's frequently used in philosophy, but the idea here is if something is immanent, it is written into the fabric of something, so that it's always somewhat present in any conversation about it. And this kind of refers to Foucault's neat idea of power knowledge, right? Because remember, he said that all knowledge claims are related to power claims, but that these things shift frequently, right? His examples of dragons in the 1750s disappearing only 10 years later, right? Something that was certain went away because power moves around. So knowledge moves around too. And that's what is meant by resistance being imminent to the social. Anytime there's a claim for knowledge and a power system, there's a possibility of undoing that power knowledge system because it has to prove itself in every moment. So anytime you're faced with a claim of power knowledge, you can reject the claim of power knowledge. This possibility of rejecting the claim is the weakness of the system, so to speak, and what will produce revolutions in thought and revolutions in practice as well. And so the alternative is about rejecting the power knowledge claim of college admissions, which was described through the link and the impact as being this concept of human capital and the nihilism that accompanies it. So you can reject the nihilist position of being human capital by actively subjectivizing yourself outside the scope of productivity. So more kind of flowery language. But what this means in basic terms is find a way to value yourself and your life outside of the admissions process. Finding things to value about yourself that aren't connected to, a future employer. Finding ways to spend your time that aren't necessarily going to turn up on a college application, but which still bring you happiness. So, an example of that would be instead of joining, the band so that you can play an instrument, even if you don't care about instruments, but you're doing it to get into college, you would, read a book you like. The point is that I can't tell you what it is. You have to pick it yourself. That's like the point of the alternative, is that every individual finds their own pathway to meaningful self-engagement. I think an interesting point to make here is that, like, in the context of debate, this is kind of an interesting argument. There's a large number of people who are doing debate to get into better colleges. So this alternative has a lot of flexibility in the way it talks about debate and what we do in debate. And I'm not going to go into all of the potential applications of this concept, but it would be a very interesting turn in a 1NR to say that, well, like if your opponent makes a theory argument or whatever, you would say that, ultimately the purpose of debate is not to function as just another pipeline in producing college or Ivy League applicants, but rather has a function here and now in the way that we question and engage with concepts of and expose the workings of power knowledge, which would set up your alternative as prior to whatever framework argument the AF has made. That's just a strategic possibility of this alternative, and one of the reasons I included it in the 1NC. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the top 5 affirmative responses to this sort of argument, and then the things the neg can say in response to those arguments. So the first thing the AF might say in response is they might make a link-turn argument. They might say standardized tests attempt to quantify student progress and thus are the exam. Remember, we talked about the exam earlier in this video as being the primary tool of a surveillance regime, because, in the Panopticon, there's always the threat that someone's watching you, and eventually you need to prove the threat's real by examining somebody. And they might also say that, like, having a standardized test result in a clear number score is the perfection of biopower at the level of the population. Because remember, the definition of biopower is the control of populations, so not specific individuals, but a whole group of people, trying to get them to live the way you want them to. So you have to use statistical methods and computers and information to make that happen. So big data is a big part of that, and you can kind of see that reflected in modern debates about Google and data privacy and the way that data gets used by advertising companies. So the neg response to this argument is that tests that are standardized allow distance between the person who's taking the test and the person who grades the test. And that the modern form of examination, which proclaims to examine your internal self, not things you do, but what's inside you, like your personality, is more insidious and coercive, and that it manufactures consent for itself by convincing you that it's in your own best interest to be examined this way, and thus it's difficult to be critical of it. And that's the impact level debate. The second is they might say biopower is good because it increases quality of life. The negative response is that biopower subverts the ethical substance of life. This is the nihilism argument, because morality itself cannot function without choice, freedom, and the ability to reason otherwise, which can't exist in the ontological frame of the affirmative, which posits itself as necessary and tries to get you to agree to it. They might say the alternative doesn't solve biopower, because biopower is big and your alternative isn't. Remember, the only necessary strategic function of the alternative is to solve your links to win the debate. But the alternative does move towards solving your impact as well, because it creates these technologies of the self to counter power knowledge here and now. It functionally takes the power out of biopower by allowing us to write our own narrative instead of using what other people say. Because Foucault thinks that power is inevitable and adheres in every claim to knowledge which we need to make in order to function in the world, but he does think that power can be used towards good ends. So the good end in the case of the alternative is countering nihilism by finding a way of relating to ourselves that is not based on a restrictive ontology, but a permissive ontology, one that allows meaning to be constructed. The fourth argument the affirmative might make is that there's no internal link chain from holistic admissions, which exist in the status quo. In the large impacts, not necessarily in the 1 and C, but the impact file includes things like extinction or eugenics and racism, that there's no clear internal link chain from those things. But the negative response to this is that the discussion of ontology is important because it frames what is possible. Remember, ontology is a discussion about what can exist in the world. So, under a particular ontological frame, certain events become conceivable or not conceivable based on those predetermined commitments. And life as an object, an ontological statement, life is something that can be controlled, which is the central thesis of biopower, because it's a control over life. If life is an object, then it's possible to eliminate it. And no genocidal conditions can exist without this central ontological position. And the impact evidence describes this. For example, the Crows 97 evidence in the impact section says that when life becomes an object, it's possible to destroy life in the name of life, right? Because you can manipulate body counts or outcomes. And an example of what Kuros would be talking about would be, the atomic strikes at the end of World War II. The justification for those nuclear bombs was that they would ultimately save more lives than were cost by using the bombs. That may or may not be true. Historians argue one way or the other on that question. But what did happen was life was killed in the name of life, which is a very interesting situation to be in. And the argument that you can make is that the alternative solves this ontological question about life as an object. So the risk that the AF metaphysics causes, a second Holocaust is a disad, even if you don't win 100% risk that it exists. So any risk would be sufficient to weigh this impact if you've won your alternative solves, just based on how debate math works. Now, the final argument the AF might make is a permutation, because it's a critique. They might say permutation do both and not explain. But any permutation they go for will probably eliminate both standardized tests and holistic review in favor of some unknown third method. This would allow the AF to not have to deal with your criticisms of holistic review, because the resolution doesn't state what the AF actually has to defend. The negative response to this is that competitive decisions are inevitable because of scarce resources, right? The claim is that power is inevitable, because we need knowledge, and competitive decisions would equally be inevitable. We have to make claims about the world. So we can't try to escape having to do that, but we have to find a better way of doing it. And any third option presented by the AF is either going to be extra topical and unfair. So there are strategic situations where, based on one AR spin or this permutation, you would just attach a topicality argument. But it's probably easier to go for intrinsicness. Intrinsicness on a permutation means that the affirmative has added something to their plan or to their affirmative, which is not in the 1AC, as an attempt to escape offense. So if they never mentioned this third option anywhere in the 1AC, and then they use it in their permutation, that's intrinsicness, which is unfair because it's unpredictable and rewrites the story of the affirmative after the 1NC, which deprives you of stable link ground. Another common argument to make against permutations is that links are disadds to the permutation. This is a generic statement, but what it means is that if the permutation links to your links, and thus your impact exists in the world of the permutation, that's a reason to prefer the alternative without the AF. So you would then need to explain which links and what the disadds are in the world of the permutation. So the argument would be that simply replacing criteria that exist in the status quo with some other set of criteria is going to replicate nihilism for the same reasons it does in the status quo, that it attempts to objectively know which candidates are better than other candidates and creates a hierarchy where people need to be a certain way in order to access resources, and that's an unstable ontology, right? It would depend on what specifically the AF said. And finally, the thing that you might answer this permutation with is to explain why the thing that the permutation attempts to write out of your affirmative is good. So you would just say standardization is preferable to caring practices, right? Caring practices meaning disciplinary institutions, things that claim to be in your self-interest but are trying to get you to live and exist in a certain way. Standardization is preferable to those things. And this is a claim that is warranted by the link and impact level of the critique, because, right, it's a critique of attempting to have disciplinary institutions know and control your internal self. So protecting your internal self is preferable to not, which means that just defending standardization good will probably be better than whatever the permutation advocated for. And you can then argue that standardization doesn't link to their offense if you want to go for this argument, so that's totally fine as well. And I think that's a complete overview of the critique. Any other questions you have can be answered by doing research into the articles that are linked, so you can read the rest of these articles or do your own research. There's tons of resources online about these questions, and good luck.